So next Tuesday night, we'll start the Torah cycle over. We finish Deuteronomy, and then we turn back, we go back to Genesis, which is a perfect time for us to talk about what we're talking about tonight, which is one of my favorite subjects to ever talk about, which is the Torah. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the composition of the Torah. And depending on the time, we will do a couple of text studies of explaining and showing evidence or proof of some of our theories about how the Bible was written. And then, of course, on my links that I'll share with people online, because remember, all these links that I'm showing for reading more about it are up on our website or up on the online learning, and you can touch those links and go right to some of these things. And today, some of the things I will share, I have a couple of links to the people who taught me, my professors, so that you can actually hear. And one of them has passed. Lulov? Well, no, yeah, I mean, people should shake it now or at the end. I mean, I didn't want to take the people who are who are not here. Yeah. Um, so yes, I'm going to have some of my teachers teach you about this. So we're talking about the Torah and the Tanakh and what the Hebrew Bible is and how, to some extent, how it came to be. And so that's an ambitious project to undertake, but it's really important and it's very, very foundational because for us, the Torah is really the basis, not just for our laws, but it's a basis for who we are. And it's the basis to some extent for, it's one of the pillars we talk about of Judaism, of kind of understanding what is a Jew, is the relationship that we have with the text, with the Torah. It's our way of understanding God. It's our way of understanding how we interact with human beings, how we interact with nature, and the principles of, and the ethical principles that we have. So the first thing that I want to kind of talk about is the fact that we use words like we use the word Torah sometimes, and we're not very clear about what we mean when we say Torah as Jews, because sometimes we clearly mean the Torah, meaning the Torah scrolls that we have in the Ark, the 5 books. But in reality, oftentimes we say Torah when we're talking about the whole Bible. We really are talking about the Tanakh. And sometimes we actually, even more broadly, just talk about Torah as all the laws, including the oral Torah, which we call the Talmud, and the continuation of understanding God and the mitzvot, the commandments, through text and through studying the text and interpreting the text. So sometimes Torah is used even more broad than just the written Bible. And so I want to show you first on this chart, which I also have now for you. I've never done this chart, and through the help of AI, I was able to create this chart, which is cool because it would have taken me a really long time to do this on my own. And I've never seen this chart before. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means I haven't seen it before and I haven't seen somebody do this. They could, and it could be somewhere, but I haven't seen this. And that is, I wanted to show you what we mean when we say the Tanakh, what we mean when people then also talk about the Old Testament. The Old Testament is really the Christian word for it. It comes from this idea that there was a First Testament and then there was a New Testament that came later and to some extent completed it. So one of the things that Jewish people oftentimes are kind of like conscious of is not using the word Old Testament, because if you say the word Old Testament or OT, it presumes that there's a New Testament. So we oftentimes use the word Tanakh or Hebrew Bible. And what the Tanakh is actually an acronym. It's an acronym for 3 words we have in Hebrew. Torah, which is the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, with the part that we'll start reading again at finish and then start reading again at Simchat Torah. The Nevi'im, the prophets, which are not just the works of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but go all the way through the history too, the primary history. And then the Ketuvim, which is what we're reading right now on Tuesday mornings, it's the general texts, the miscellaneous texts, which have Psalms, has Proverbs, it has wisdom texts, but it also has it also has lots of other texts. And I just realized, folks, I did not put us up on, I did not, uh, I did not put us up on Facebook. So I apologize to our Facebook people, and I'm going to rectify that problem right now. I was too busy talking about the Dodgers, unfortunately. Um, so that's the way we organize it in those three divisions. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is not the way Christian scholars have organized our Hebrew Bible. And that's why I actually showed this chart, which has the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, next to the Old Testament, which is the way the Christians organize our Bible. Now, one of the reasons why they organize the Bible the way that they do is because, again, they have a Christian Bible. They have another text. And so, because of that, they organize it in a slightly different way, with a slightly different logic. Now, again, it's not that they took out books. As a matter of fact, they didn't take out books, they added books, but it's organized in a slightly different way. It also came to exist in a slightly different way, in the sense that our Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, was primarily written in Hebrew, though we did see, and for those who were with us in Daniel just a few months ago, we actually have a little bit of it that's written in Aramaic. The Old Testament, the version of the Old Testament that is in the Christian Bible, comes to us through the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation, which was done a long time ago. It's an old text, it's 2,000 years old, and we'll say right now that some of the versions of the Septuagint are older than the oldest Hebrew texts we have. The irony is, until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't have any texts that were older than the Septuagint. That was the oldest Hebrew versions. I mean, the oldest versions of the Hebrew Bible that we had were the Septuagint. So it's a very old text. That was translated into Greek, into Latin, the Vulgate, the Latin copy, and then that was translated into the languages like English, Spanish, and every other language in the modern world that we have still came out of this transmission through the churches, specifically Eastern Orthodox churches and the Catholic Church. So this is how the Hebrew Bible is also different, is that it hews more towards the original. It hews more towards the original Hebrew. What's interesting is that when the King James Bible was written in English, when they translated this Latin text into English, what was so special is that the English translators, hired by King James of England, decided to consult with Jews and Hebrew-speaking Bible readers, the Jewish people, and said, well, what should this translation really be? And so they actually, in the English translation, the King James Version went back to some of the original Hebrew, which is very cool. I mean, that just happens to be something that happened for us as English speakers, that we have a very good translation of the Bible, the King James, which is then the translation that many of the other translations are based on in English. What's interesting, of course, is that it's also it's divided slightly different. It's divided in different ways, as we said. Chronicles, Samuel, Kings, all these books that we have 1 and 2 books of. In the Christian ordering, they split these books. We just talked about how Chronicles is split into 2. And we follow that order. But originally in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, there weren't 2. There was just 1 book of Chronicles, 1 book of Samuel, 1 book of Kings, which is why when we look at our total number of books, it's 24. The Protestant church, because they split up a lot of these books, they have a different order, right? It comes out to more. The Catholic Church comes out to even more, because we're going to talk about it. They added books that we don't even have. We call them the Deuterocanonicals or the Apocrypha. I'll mention that in a second. The way we divide the Bible is, again, for us, the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Christians developed a different way of looking at it. They kept the Torah, but they split up what we have as the prophets, which are partly prophetic and partly history. They split that up and have a history where they have books like Samuel or Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, which are historic books. They took them off out of the prophets and put them with what we call a history, which is where they also have Chronicles. Then they have poetry and wisdom, which are books like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and grouped together. And so they have a logical way of doing it, but they put the prophets at the end. And part of the reason why they put the prophets at the end is because where the Hebrew Bible ends in the book of Chronicles, which is what we're reading right now, or coming to the end of it on the Tuesday mornings, it ends with the Chronicles, which is the Jews coming back from exile. The Christian Bible ends with the prophet Malachi. And the prophet Malachi talks about, if you recall, the great and awesome day when Elijah is going to come and announce the time of the Messiah. Well, they thought that's a great way of ending the Bible because that leads right to Jesus. This is why they did it. And the order of it becomes significant because then, if you look at what happens, the power of understanding what is going on is that where the Hebrew Bible ends with a story of the people coming home and hope, the Christian Bible actually ends with the book of Revelations, because the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, ends with Malachi foretelling Jesus, and then you have the Gospels, which then end with Revelation, which is the end of the world. And so it has a different order, not just because people thought, well, it makes sense, we're going to finish with, this message or that message because it's a more hopeful message. There's a logic to it, which is the Bible in the Tanakh, the way we have it in the Hebrew Bible, it begins with creation and ends with the restoration of the Jews back to their homeland. The Christian Bible begins with creation in Genesis and ends with destruction, with the end of the world, which is a logic to it. I mean, you can say what you want about it. There's a logic to that. The world begins, and at the end, it's destroyed. And then there'll be something after that. It's not like it's just over, but it's a different answer. Look, some people would say you got to end the story the way it ends. And for Christians, that's the way the story would end. And remember, it's written at a time when Christian life is pretty depressing. Because when the book of Revelation is written, when John at Patmos, and I went to his house where he wrote it in Greece a couple months ago, Christians were being murdered. The average lifespan for Christians, he happened to live a long time, John at Patmos, but every other one of John the evangelist, when all the other gospel writers and all the other disciples and all the other people that are following Jesus are being martyred, like every one of them except for him, it's pretty dismal. And so the Christian Bible, remember, was finished with that. Finished at that moment. I don't know that Christianity would have made sense if it had ended the Bible where the church is now the most powerful entity in the world, which it was 250 years later, during the time of Constantine. Would have been a different book, different emphasis, but it didn't. It ended in 100 when Christians are being murdered. And there's not a lot of hope, at least in this world, but there'll be hope in another world. The Hebrew Bible is written and edited, and as we're going to see, over 1,000 years, literally 1,000 years. From the first things that we can kind of date, which we're going to talk about in a moment, to the book of Daniel, which is the last book, which we kind of even know when it was finished. The last pages of the Bible, if you will, that are written in Aramaic, not even in Hebrew anymore. That's another clue, right? It's not even written in Hebrew. It's 1,000 years. That's a long time for the Bible to be written over. And a lot of experiences, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of different things are captured there, which is why some of the Hebrew Bible is kind of positive and happy, and some of it's not, because it's written over 1,000 years. A lot of things happen. Now, interestingly, all of this, all of this kind of got shaken up when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And that's why I have this last column. Because we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found lots of things there. And what was interesting about it is it was frozen in time because the people who wrote them and edited them or copied them or collected them, whatever you want to say, the people who put those in the caves never got to come back and to get them. We assume they were killed during the revolt. that destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed most of the Jewish communities, that these people were never able to come back and get their books. And what we found there was fragments from every book of the Bible except for Esther, which has led some people to think that Esther wasn't universally accepted as a book that which should be kept. I told you before, it might be because some people thought Esther was a joke and was a farce and wasn't meant to be taken seriously. And maybe the people in Qumran didn't think it was serious enough. It also could be that we just never found it. That maybe it got destroyed. We know some of them got destroyed. We know some of them didn't survive. We have broken jars that there were things inside them, and because the jar broke, the things decayed. We know that. So maybe we just don't have it. But the problem is we found lots of fragments, and we find lots of fragments of certain books. We find no fragments for Esther. What's also interesting about the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, is that we don't know how they were ordered, because the fragments we found are in some cases just a piece of a text. And in some cases, even when we find a whole scroll, it's just that scroll, the scroll of Isaiah. We don't know what came after Isaiah for them. And because we found these in jars, and we found the scroll in one jar and another jar, and again, sometimes just a fragment of a scroll, we don't know how they ordered it. We don't know how the people of Qumran ordered the books. So we don't really know. So we don't know what the order was. But we do know that we found lots of copies of Psalms. We found lots of copies of the book of Deuteronomy. And we found lots of copies of Isaiah. Isaiah, by far the most ridiculous amounts. Found a great Isaiah scroll, which you can see in the Hebrew in Israel Museum. It's a breathtaking scroll because, again, it's a complete scroll, and we can compare it to the book of Isaiah that we have. And again, we found everything in there except for Esther, sorry. And we found some versions of the Hebrew text. Some of them are not as close to our Hebrew Bible, the copy that we have, what we call the Masoretic text. It's actually closer to the Septuagint, which tells us that maybe the Septuagint in some cases was written on a more traditional or a cleaner copy with less errors, maybe even you could say, because there are scribal errors, which one of the links that I have for you is going to talk about scribal errors from my professor, David Noel Friedman, who talked about the problem of scribal errors, because we know there are scribal errors. We know there's scribal errors. Orthodox Jews know there's scribal errors. What we try to do as people who study the Bible is understand that some people say, you can't figure out what's in the Bible until you understand that there are scribal errors that you have to account for. So before you say who wrote what in the Bible, you have to say, is that the way it originally looked? I mean, there are some people who that's all they talk about, is what they call source criticism. It's like, is that text the right text? Is that even the right text? And then there's other people who say, okay, we know that there's thousands of errors. We know that there's thousands. I mean, in some cases, thousands of errors. I mean, depending on who you ask. But do they fundamentally change certain things? And I would say no. There's certain things that we're going to talk about here, which is how the Bible was created. It doesn't change those things. But there are people, and I've been to these biblical conferences where people will start talking about something that they notice, or they try to argue that, hey, let's try to figure out who wrote this. And somebody will say, you have no idea what you're talking about, because that's not even the original text. That's not even what it says, because you didn't look at the scroll in Qumran. You didn't look at the Septuagint. Why are you talking about what's in the Hebrew Bible? Because you didn't look at these other variants. You didn't look at these other texts. So I've seen this before where people are like, why are the point you're talking about is not even, you're not even on the right page, so to speak. So being a scribe at any point, right? Up until today. And even today, think about it. When you cut and paste something, again, this is why the link that I have for David Noel Friedman talking about this, we make mistakes all the time. where we cut and paste things, and we made a mistake, and all we had to do was cut and paste it, and we cut and paste it from the wrong place because we saw the word twice. That's the biggest scribal error, is a scribe would see a word that was repeated and didn't catch the fact that he cut from the wrong usage of that word. It happens. That's the most common one. Yeah. What's crazy is it happened in some cases 2,000 years ago, and we've been following that error for a long time. Again, I would make the case it doesn't fundamentally change a lot of this. But there are some people who are like, before you can talk about, the words that are used there, or the word that was used there, let's agree on the right copy. We'll get to that. So that's Qumran. And of course, I want to say that there are parts of the Qumran that have books that are not in either the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or in what we call, again, the Deuterocanonicals, the Apocrypha. These are the books that the Catholics kept, the Catholic Church kept. The Protestant Church decided not to keep these in their Bible. They wanted to do what the Jews did, and so they did not put books in their Old Testament, and I call it Old Testament because that's what they call it. That's for Christians. Their Old Testament, the Protestant Old Testament did not keep these books. Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Maccabees, Baruch. You will find these only in a Catholic Bible. In the Qumran section of the Qumran text we found, we look at this section here on the chart. We have the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, Temple Scroll, War Scroll, Community Rule. These last three are specifically, it seems like, for the Qumran community. Like nobody who didn't live in Qumran would even care about it. But the Book of Enoch, we know, because Christians also read the Book of Enoch. It's a very interesting book. The Book of Jubilees as well. A lot of that stuff kind of fills in some of the blanks of how did we get to the Book of Revelation? How do we have these stories about angels and kind of fallen angels and things like that? Well, we find them in these books. And in the fact that the Qumran community had Enoch and Jubilees. Somebody just wrote to me recently, one of our congregants was reading the Book of Enoch, and he was like, whoa, what's this? I mean, this is crazy. I'm like, well, it's in Qumran. I mean, Jews read it. The people of Qumran also believed that there were still revelation and prophecy that was happening. And again, that's something that the Christians also believed, because they believed that revelation was still happening. And that's one of the reasons why Qumran and the Christian Bible have some greater similarities. By the time of Qumran, there were already Jews that were saying, no, this is what's in the Bible. And there's no more revelation, and there's no more books that we're adding to the Bible. So as Jews were saying, there's no more biblical books, Christians were saying, we have another Bible. That's not a coincidence, folks. The fact that Jews said at a certain point, there are no more books of the Bible, was because there was a group of people who were very Jewish at one point saying, hey, but what about this book? We read this book. It's the Gospel of Matthew. And there were Jews that were saying, that's not in the Bible. It's not in the Bible. So one of the reasons we have the books that we have, and we'll talk about this, the canonization, is because there is a challenge to what is a legitimate book. And when we found Qumran, then we realized, oh, it wasn't just Christians that were a challenge to Jews, specifically Rabbinic Judaism. It was also people like the Essenes, the people at Qumran, who are saying there's all these other books that we read too, like Enoch and Jubilees. And we know the Qumran people were not the only people reading that, because the rabbis read it. There are warnings the rabbis give to other rabbis saying, don't read these books. Don't read them. Because they didn't want people to think that these were holy books. We'll get to that. We're going to finish with that, actually. And that's, by the way, that's the way you decide what's in your community, by saying these are the books we read and these are the books we don't read. And with this fear, of course, that this was going to lead people to other ideas, understand it's the same thing that the church ended up having to do with heretical ideas. And they said, we're not going to keep these books. We're not going to let even people see these books. That's what happens. But how did we get to the Torah? How did we get to this written work that we had? How did the Torah come to be? Now, a lot of this is speculation because we don't have a written account of how this happened. But part of it is based on what we have, the text that we have, and part of it is based on, I would say, common sense, and part of it's based on archaeology. Part of it's based on like what we know about people at a certain period of time based on the archaeological evidence we have. So what we believe is that the earliest stories that we have that are in our Bible were oral stories. They were stories that were passed on from generation to generation. Part of it is because they have an oral, especially the older stories, they have a flow to them that sounds like it was passed on orally. How do we know that? Because there are people who study the way stories are told, and they say there's certain styles that people have when they tell an oral story, which seem to be very common in certain parts of the Bible. Do they sometimes make that fit their belief? Yes, probably. They say, well, this sounds like a song that people sang. Well, that might be older. Example of that would be the Song of the Sea, the Shirat Hayam in Exodus, where we read that story, or when we get to that part of the Bible, especially the Song of the Sea, people have pointed out that sounds like an old song. It sounds like a song that people sang. Maybe that's, again, one of the oldest parts of the Bible. It's possible. We also know from kind of logic is that the earlier stories in the book of Genesis were the types of stories that people would share to kind of establish a common identity, a common heritage. When people tell a story about Abraham or Adam and Eve, they're telling stories about how we're connected. We have a common ancestor. We have a common heritage. You know, look, people sometimes mythologize that a little bit in the sense that, like, you know, people used to tell, and I think it's a healthy thing. When people, you know, would tell stories about, you know, the pilgrims in this country, you know, okay, a fraction of us have relatives who were on the Mayflower, but those became common narratives, and they became stories that people felt were their common stories. Now, again, we live in a time when people kind of destroy those myths, and they take joy in telling people, well, your ancestors weren't there, and whatever, your people were, you know, were not there, or they were slaves then, or the, you know, and so the reality of the story becomes, no, that's not really your story. And there's a loss that we have with that, obviously. I mean, there's a certain knowledge of the truth that people say, well, I know the truth now, but there's also, it also destroys our unity. It destroys our commonality by saying, no, that's not your story. That's their story. We see that in the Bible. We kind of understand it because, again, we have archaeological evidence for certain things. And so we know that there were these stories that united people who might not have even been necessarily connected, especially those stories where we read it in Genesis about these ancient divisions of the nations. There's no evidence, as I said before, that the Canaanites were descendants of Ham, of Egypt, and of the African folk. But our Bible says that. You know, why? Because they didn't like the Canaanites. Our people hated the Canaanites. They were at war with the Canaanites. And so they didn't want to be related to them. Other peoples, you know, maybe we had some affinity with them. They got along better with us. They became maybe more related to us, like the Ammonites and the Moabites. They're related through Lot. And they're a little weird, but they're our cousins. So these stories, I think, actually tell us a lot about who our friends were and who we didn't like. Around about the 10th century, these stories start getting written down. Why do they get written down? Interestingly, some of the stories got written down once Jerusalem became a city and became the capital. And the narrative of how King David and then his son King Solomon become kings becomes something that people really want to know, and they want to be like everybody else by having a royal record. And it seems like those stories that were written by scribes during that period of time were written with the intentionality of establishing the kingdom. What's interesting, of course, is that some of those stories, which are some of my favorite stories, are not always flattering to David. Those are some of the earliest books of the Bible that we believe were written. How do we know that? Partly because of the language, partly because of the Hebrew that's used in those sections of the Bible, which I'm going to show you in a sec. And partly because there's certain clues that the writers will put in there, which sound like certain things hadn't happened yet. They didn't know about those things. And when they do know about certain things that shouldn't have happened yet, we can kind of say, well, that's an anachronism. I pointed one out yesterday with the story of Ephraim in the book of Chronicles. There's other places where you have stories and you go, well, wait a second, that didn't happen yet. And those definitely create problems in understanding the text to some, or believing that the text was written by one person. But it's not necessarily a problem if you look at it from the standpoint of, yeah, but what can we learn from this? What are the bigger lessons here that we can take away? So I will show you this next chart that I want to share with you, which again will be up there be up online so you can download it. We believe, again, by saying we, the archaeological, historical, critical, we sometimes will also call it modern scholarship, is that this is the way the Bible starts to come into existence. So it says historical, critical versus rabbinic, which is the traditional Orthodox view of this too. And that is, again, this is the way the stories develop, the earliest versions of these stories. When we get to this period, which I'm talking about right now, the United Monarchy, this is where we start to see the stuff being written. And one of the earliest versions of a text that we have, we call the J source, which is called the J source because this author used the name Yud-He Vav-He, which Christians would say is written out kind of like Jehovah, but it's not. So the J is for that, but that's not God's name, but it's the Lord. It's the name we're not supposed to say, so I'm not going to try to correct it, but that's what they call it. What's interesting about it, and what's very easy to remember about it, is also J. Well, it's not really also J, but we can remember it this way, is that this person lived in the tribe of Judah, in the kingdom of what will become the kingdom of Judah, King David's and King Solomon's tribe. Our tribe. By our tribe, I mean the Jewish people, and to some extent Christians too, who trace their connection back to Jesus. Judah, the Jews. And this author tells really great stories, wonderful stories, really the stories that we remember the most. Sometimes God seems a little too human, which is why it says anthropomorphic God, is God sometimes seems to be a little bit more human than God is depicted in some of the other books, and it's noticeable. And we're going to look again. I said we'll either have time to look at one story or two stories where I can show you this. Of course, the rabbinic tradition is that we know who writes these books. King David writes Psalms. Solomon builds a temple and is responsible for Proverbs and for Ecclesiastes. And this is what happens during this period for them, in the sense that the Bible starts to be developed, but the Torah already exists by this period of time. Again, the historical part of us would say, but it can't, because there are references in it that we don't have. One second. So, the next, okay, let me just tell you one of them, because I just mentioned it, and so I'm going to tell it to you again. because the Chronicles talked about it. We talked about it on Tuesday. Chapter 36 of Genesis gives us a list of kings of Edom. Those kings didn't live during the time of Moses. They lived during the time up through King David and even after King David. Why are those there in chapter 36? It's a tough answer. For people who are traditional, who say the Torah was written during the time of, I'm talking the Torah, this is Genesis, this is the first book, that it's a prophecy that God knew and told Moses who the kings of Edom were going to be. A more likely explanation is that the writer of that part of Genesis included a list of kings, not really thinking or caring that someone's going to say, but Moses didn't know that, because he didn't write it thinking that Moses had to write it. So Genesis 36 is one of the most obvious places, and it's a whole chapter. So it's not like it's a line. It's a whole chapter of kings. And by the way, the irony is, who cares? The Edomite kings, I don't care, but the people during that time cared. The Edomites were one of our nearest enemies, friends sometimes. And remember, they're descendants of Esau, of Jacob's brother. I mean, they're real cousins, very close. They're descendants of Isaac. So we cared. We don't care today because there's no more Edomites, but they were important in this period of time. So yeah, the irony is that it's not really a super important part of the Bible, we would say, not something we have to worry about today. Honestly, I mean, chapter 36 of Genesis is one of the least relevant parts of the Bible that you can ever point to. A list of kings that are not Jewish kings. So during this next period of time, when the kingdom separates into the north and south, we actually now have another writer we call the E-source, and we call him the E-source. He's from the northern kingdom. We know that because he's very concerned with cities in the north, people in the north. He's connecting things to the north, but he's called the E-source because he uses the word Elohim for God. He doesn't call God Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. He calls God Elohim. It helps us understand these things because when we see one writer always refer to God as Elohim and another writer always refer to God as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, we suddenly see this. And what's interesting is this really wasn't pointed out until the 19th century. There were German scholars who started looking at this and saying, let's try to figure out these different strands that are there. The Jewish community was just starting to study the Bible this way through a critical lens. And so Jews started studying it. But obviously it was a challenge to Orthodox Judaism that said, wait a second, this can't be written by these different authors because it was all dictated by God to Moses. Moses wrote it down. So we have the J author, we have the E author, and then around this time, right before the Babylonian exile, we have the book of Deuteronomy. We say it's written during the time of King Josiah, who undertakes this wonderful reformation of Judah, and he tries to get everybody doing the right thing. We're going to celebrate Passover. We're going to read what Moses wants us to do. We're going to cling to the mitzvot. We're going to go to the temple. We're going to offer sacrifices. We're going to do away with all this idolatry. He's a great king. One problem, he gets killed in battle like right away. He's like, you're like, well, this is the greatest king ever. No, the greatest king since the dynasty, since David, gets killed. And the people that come after him are really not good. His sons and grandsons are the ones who lose the kingdom. They're the ones, Joachim, Jehoiakim, all these people, Zedekiah. These are the people that lose the kingdom to the Babylonians. Within 30 years of his death, the country is done. So he tried, but he doesn't live very long. He's killed in a battle with the Egyptians. And then we get into this next period, which is the exile. And this is what we're reading about now on Tuesdays. We're reading Ezra and Nehemiah. We're reading about these guys. And they do this very important thing, which is they start to edit the Bible together. And they actually, of course, have to start with the Torah itself. And we believe that Ezra was the guy that started weaving these things together. Because he had one more source, which was probably very close to his heart. We call the P source, the priestly source, because Ezra was a priest. He's very concerned with genealogies, as we read in the book of Chronicles, and we read it in the book of Ezra. He is very concerned with who is kosher and who's not kosher. And I mean, not like by what they eat, but who's their dad and who's their mom. And he doesn't want people who are from pagan homes, from Jews that are not, we're not really sure where they are. He is very concerned with genealogies. And the priestly author is very concerned with genealogies. So whenever we go into the Torah and we see a list of genealogies like Genesis 36, the lineage of the Edomite kings, we go, that's the priestly author. That's the author who's obsessed with genealogies. But they're, look, they're important. They tell us who's connected to who. So he's really concerned with that. And of course, we believe he's the author of the book of Leviticus, which is all about priestly behavior. We don't think there would even be a book of Leviticus without the priest. I mean, doesn't seem like there would be. So why is this so important? Of course, this is when the Jewish people are returning and they need to have the Torah. They need to have this. And after that, once the Torah is kind of a scroll, then they start to talk about, okay, for the next few hundred years, we're going to decide what other books from Isaiah, from Psalms, from all the other books, what we call Nevi'im and Ketuvim, sometimes again, the other part of the Tanakh, we call sometimes just Nach, because we separate, the Torah is the Torah, right? And the others, the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, some people call it Nach. Now, of course, in the Orthodox world, the Nach is not as well known as the Torah. The focus is going to be on Torah, a lot more study of the Torah. But Nach is obviously something that I spend a lot of time with, and we've been spending a lot of time with it because we've been doing it on Tuesdays for 5 years now. We did not do Tuesday mornings, did not do the Torah in this last study. We started right with Joshua, and we went right into what we call the Nach. I don't call it Nach because that's only a term used in the Orthodox world to kind of separate Torah from Nevi'im and Ketuvim. But during this period, for about the next 400 years, these things are done. And then at a certain period of time, again, what we call the rabbinic period, the rabbis decided what's going to be canonized, what's going to be there and what's not going to be there. And when you think about it, what is really the operating factor here? Why do we have to do this? Because if we don't, we're going to lose our texts. And in the case of war, destruction, we're going to forget who we are. We can take our books with us. And Ezra knew that because he had just returned with the people. He said, we need to make these stories, the covenant, we need to make them the way that we organize ourselves and have a text that no matter what, we can survive. And that's one of the reasons why Ezra doesn't care about a king. He's thinking bigger. It's like, who cares who the king is? Let the Babylonians be king. Let the Persians be king. Let the next empire be king. As long as we have a Torah, it won't matter. And he was right. And the rabbis who decide what's going to be in the rest of the Bible, when they make that final decision, they're also right. Because they realize if we don't come up with what's in and what's out, we're going to lose what makes us Jewish. If we go too far out of the realm of what's Jewish law, we're going to lose what we are. And that's what they did. They decided what books would be in and out. And they did it not in really same kind of circumstances. What did they do it under? The Romans. They were worried that they were going to get killed. They were worried that another generation of rabbis is going to get killed. And so just like Ezra, these guys now say, Ezra says what's in the Torah. The rabbis now say, this is what's in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to show you this very quickly from the Mishnah. And I showed you a little bit on this on Wednesday night, a long time ago. This discussion that the rabbis have about what's in and what's out. They don't say that. They don't say this is in and that's out. They don't say, and here's how we sat around and decided which books and where they go. It's not there. I wish it was. It's not there. We decided, no. It's much more ambiguous. Let's put it that way. They have a discussion here in the Mishnah, and it's with one of our favorite rabbis, Rabbi Akiva. Is one of the guys mentioned here. There's other rabbis here too, but his contemporaries. They're talking about what book defiles hands, which is a really weird concept. Defiling hands, that sounds bad. But the reason is that for ritual purposes, your hands have to be clean. And if you touch the book, you can't just touch anything afterwards. So it's not really defiling, but it renders you in a certain state. It's holy state. It's like, oh, I touched it. I can't touch something stupid right now. So that's what they say. And they say, I'll start here. A single sheet on which there are written 85 letters, as many are in the section, and it came to pass when the ark set forward, that section of the Bible in the book of Samuel, or excuse me, in book of Numbers, that is considered a long enough text. And then they say all the holy scriptures defile the hands. The Song of Songs and Kohelet, which is Ecclesiastes, they defile the hands. Why would they even have to say that? Well, Rabbi Judah says the Song of Songs defiles the hands, but there's a dispute about Kohelet. So he's saying Song of Songs is in the Bible. I'm not really sure about Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. Rabbi Yossi says Kohelet does not defile the hands, but there is a dispute about the Song of Songs. Is Kohelet in it? Is Ecclesiastes in? Is Song of Songs in? Rabbi Shimon says the ruling about Kohelet is one of the leniencies of Beit Shammai and one of the stringencies of Beit Hillel. So Hillel and Shammai disagreed on which books were in the Bible. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai said, I have received a tradition from the 72 elders on the day when they appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the head of the academy, the Sanhedrin, that the Song of Songs and Kohelet defile the hands. Rabbi Akiva said, far be it, no man in Israel ever disputed the Song of Songs, saying that it does not defile the hands. For the whole world is not as worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. If they had a dispute, they had a dispute only about Kohelet. Rabbi Yochanan ben Yoshua, the son of the father-in-law of Rabbi Akiva, said in accordance with the words of Ben Azai. So they disputed, and so they reached a decision. Rabbi Akiva is saying there's no question Song of Songs is holy. But the reason he says that is it's love poetry. We just read it. We read it not that long ago. They said it because there were clearly people who said Song of Songs is not supposed to be in the Bible. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's definitely supposed to be in the Bible. And it's beautiful and it's holy. It's holy of holies. It's a pretty wild thing because it's love poetry. It doesn't seem to really be about God. But he says it's all about God. The love poetry there is not about a man and a woman back and forth. It's about God, our connection to God. So you can see from that the discussions that went on amongst the rabbis about which books were holy and which ones weren't. So it's not exactly, again, the discussion where they took a vote and said, Ecclesiastes is in. What about a Song of Songs? Well, this guy argued for it and this guy argued against it, but we decided it's in. So it doesn't really give us the full view of how this was done, but it does tell us that it was being done during the time of Rabbi Akiva. And of course, that's the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's the time when people are really serious about, we better make this real. We better decide, because we have other groups that are telling us what books are in and what books aren't, and they're not even Jewish anymore, or at least they don't think they're Jewish. And then we have this other issue, which is we're being murdered. No one's going to be around to tell us. If we don't have these books in a binder by now, then who's going to tell us? And so these things were real. Now, what we also believe about how this was done is that they divided these three sections into three sections to some extent based on their length. And the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim could not be longer than the Torah. And they're basically all the same. And it has nothing to do, my friends, probably, we don't know for sure, but probably other than how much space could fit on a scroll. And how much space, my friends, I have to tell you, what's really being said there is how much can be fit on a scroll that you can put on your back in your backpack, your satchel, and get going with. Yeah. It's about enough to, again, divide it up and say, you go this way with that book and you go that way with that book, and we'll make sure the book survives. That's probably why. It fit on a scroll that we could put like we have in our ark, those scrolls. And so those scrolls, the prophets and the writings were written on scrolls that people could take with them. Any bigger, it would be too weighty, fall apart. It would rip. It would not be easily carried by a normal person. It's pretty weird to think that our Bible is somewhat a creation of how many pages essentially could fit on a press. It would be the equivalent today. We can't make that. I mean, that's why a song is 3.5 minutes, because it can fit on a 45. I mean, understand it. There's still reasons for that, Television shows were 22 minutes so that commercials could fit inside. Couldn't be longer than 22 minutes. How much stuff was cut out of great television because it had to be 22 minutes? These were formats, folks. These are editorial formats people had to follow. And we had a format that we had to follow to some extent, probably to keep ourselves having possession of the book. It's pretty weird to think about. All right. I know that's a lot to digest. I know that's a lot to take in. And in the remaining time, I'm going to show you how this works, because I want you to see. Yeah. So old. John wants to know why there's no signature. And the reason is that this was done. Partly because the editors did such an amazing job of weaving these stories together that no one really talked about it. They didn't talk about it. Now, I'm going to show you one. I'm going to show you one of the earliest, which is from the Torah portion we're going to read in a couple weeks. The flood story. Now, I could show you the Genesis story, because you know that there's two different versions. We've talked about it. There's version 1 and version 2, but they line up almost exactly in chapter 1 and chapter 2. So it doesn't really help, because I could tell you chapter 1 was written by the priestly author and chapter 2 is written by the J author. We can show them, we can read them, we can look at them, and you can see. But what's really amazing is when they're woven together, and they're woven together so beautifully that people didn't even talk about it. Okay, that's something amazing. Before I get into this and show you this, understand that just because there's two versions of a story, and I could have said this at the end, but I don't want to forget it. It's critical because it's more important than what I'm about to show you. You're going to forget what I'm going to show you. I know it. I mean, it's just normal. But I want you not to forget this. The fact that there's two versions of a creation story, the fact that there's two versions of a flood story, doesn't mean that this didn't happen. It doesn't mean that the stories are less truthful because there's two versions of them. I would say the counter is true. And one of my biblical professors taught me this. Think about it. If you have multiple versions of a story, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It actually lends better credence to the fact that it happened, or that it's very important that it happened. Because if everyone has a version of the story, that means multiple people saw it. Multiple people have a version of the story because it was important to them to teach this story. So it doesn't make it less valuable that these stories exist in different versions, or less truthful. Make the argument that it's more truthful. If only one person tells you the story, how do you know what happened? But if 3 people come and tell you this is the story, and they tell you slightly different versions of it, it doesn't mean that the story didn't happen. Everybody has their own take on it. The takes on these stories are important because we have northern traditions and southern traditions. And we believe the editor who wove these things together wanted these different traditions to be kept because they were important. They were important to some of our people. Okay? So, let's look at one that was woven together beautifully. And I mean beautifully. There's 2 versions of the flood story that are very obvious when you read them separate. They're not obvious when they're woven together. And look at this one. And again, if I have time, I'll show you one more. So this is the flood. You know the story of the flood. And it starts in... I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to read you the story as it is here, and then I'll show you how the story reads separately. The Lord saw, that's by the way our first clue that this is the J author, the Yud-He Vav-He author. The Lord saw the wickedness of man was very great, and by the way, very anthropomorphic. the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was very great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord repented that he made man on earth. By the way, very anthropomorphic. God didn't like that he made earth. He was sorry. I made a mistake. That's what it says. And it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I've created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the birds of the air, for I repent that I have made them. And Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect is his generation, and Noah walked with God. And Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make an ark of gopher wood, rooms shall you make in the ark, and shall pitch it inside and outside with pitch. And this is the fashion by which you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. A window shall you make in the ark, and to a cubit shall you finish it above. And the door of the ark shall you set it in its side. With the lower, second, and third stories shall you make it. And behold, I myself bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, where there is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is on the earth shall die. But with you I will establish my covenant, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, and your wife and your sons' wives with you. And every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shall you bring into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Sounds very much like the first chapter of creation. Same author. Of all of birds of their kind, of cattle of their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, 2 of every sort shall come to you to keep them alive. And take to you of the food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to you, and they shall be food for you and for them. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so he did. Now you see that that's in bold. We're going to come back to that in a second, because this is the way the story continues. This is the way it exists in the Bible. And the Lord said to Noah, come you and your house into the ark, for I have seen righteous before me in this generation. For I've seen, I have seen righteous. You're righteous in your generation. Of every clean beast you shall take 7 pairs, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean 1 pair, the male and his female. Of birds also by air of 7 pairs, the male and female, to keep seed alive on the face of the earth. For in 7 days I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And every living substance that I have made will I destroy from the face of the earth. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. You already noticed one difference, I think, right? One glaring difference between these 2 versions, right? Hello? What? Yeah, 7 and 2. This guy right here says that there's 7 of every pair of the clean beasts and a pair of the ones that are not clean. Yeah. So that's a little different. Well, I'm going to finish reading it and then I'll go back. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were upon the earth. And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood. You notice, by the way, how these authors are shifting back and forth. Again, these are the color. The color is an editor, but the bold and the not bold are the P and the J author. Of clean beasts and of beasts that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps upon the earth, they went in 2 by 2 into the ark, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass after 7 days, the waters of the flood were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 7th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the heavens and the windows of the heavens were open. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The same day entered Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japhet, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them into the ark. They and every beast of its kind, and all the cattle of its kind, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark, 2 of all flesh, where there was the breath of life. And those who went in, male and female, and on flesh, as God commanded them. And the Lord closed him in. And the flood was on the earth 40 days on the earth, and the water increased and bore upon the ark, and it was lifted above the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heavens were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all the flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of bird and of cattle and of beast and of every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, of every man. And all in whose nostrils were the breath of life, all that was in the dry land died. And every living substance was upon the face of the earth, both man and cattle, and the creeping things and the birds of the heavens, they were destroyed upon the earth. And only Noah remained alive, and those with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle was with him on the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. The fountains also of the deep, and the windows were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from the earth continually. And after the end of 150 days, the water were abated. And the ark rested upon, in the seventh month, on the 17th day of the month, on the seventh month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. And the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. And it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. And he sent forth a raven, which went to and fro until the waters dried up off the earth. He also sent a dove to see if the waters were abated from the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest in the sole of its foot. And she returned to the ark, and waters were upon the face of the whole earth. Then he put forth his hand and took her and pulled her into the ark. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and again he set forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked, so Noah knew the waters were abated from the earth. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and sent forth a dove, which did not return back from him any more. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, and the ground was dry. I'm going to finish with that. Well, actually, I'll read you the last line. And Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Now, before I even go back and read the stories separately, they make sense when they're read separately. But you saw already in this story one of the biggest problems. Give me one of the problems that, yes, the most obvious, I think, to some extent, is 40 days versus 150 days. They're different. Now, if you say, well, the 40 days were how long it rained for, but 150 days they were in the ark, fine. I get it. You could say that. Other than the fact that at the end here, he still says, after 40 days, Noah opened the ark. So why did it go back to the 40 days? Well, because if you read the story, the way the J author writes it, and by the way, what I love about this story and why I show this story as an example is because these examples that I just am showing you right now are very illustrative, not just of the fact that one calls God God and the other one calls him Lord. Okay, that's makes it easy. That makes it easy for us to decipher. But what really is impressive is that they betray, or not betray, I don't want to say it like in a negative way. It's very illustrative of how these authors write and what they write about. And the one where God is literally almost like a human being who says, I shouldn't have made man. And that God closes the ark up for Noah, closes it up for him. And the priestly author is a priestly author. What does he care about? What's the priestly author care about? He cares about the fact that the ark was 300 cubits. The other author doesn't tell us how big it is, but the priestly author is the author that tells us how big the ark of the covenant was and how many yards of cloth they put around the tent. That's an author who cares about details. And he also really cares about who are his sons. the J author doesn't even mention them by name. He doesn't even call them. It's just not his issue. Not in his, not in Jay's. But it's okay because the other thing that people don't notice until the stories are picked apart is this beautiful, beautiful version of the story that God remembered, right? At the end of 150 days, the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. And in the 10th month of the first day, where the tops were seen, he sent forth a raven which went to and fro until the waters were dried up off the earth. Now, what's so interesting about this is the poor raven, in the biblical mind, after these stories are woven together, doesn't do anything good because he just goes back and forth, and that's it. And then Noah sends out the dove. Well, that's in a different author. And that author has the dove goes out once, can't land anywhere, goes out the second time, comes back with a olive branch, right? Which means that there's at least somewhere to land. And then the last time the dove goes out, it never comes back. And so the dove is the hero of the story because he tells everybody you can go back. But what's weird is the raven gets trashed because everyone's scared of ravens. But what the raven really did, according to this version, is he goes back and forth until there's no more water. He actually helps make the water go away. People don't realize that because in the story, the dove comes and finishes, is the guy that actually tells them. But in the original story, not the original story, in the priestly story, the dove actually goes back and forth and helps in the water. It's a totally different understanding. Poor raven, I feel bad for the raven because the raven's actually really, really a good. Not this season, but look again what the priestly author is concerned about. The priestly author is concerned about the animals going in. The priestly author is concerned about what kind of animals, right? What kind of animals are going to go in that ark, right? And, this is male and female, just as God created them, just like you said at the beginning, right? It's beautiful. But the J author is concerned with life in a poetic and very descriptive way. Remember, the J author is the second version of creation. The J author is the God that blows air, life into the atom, into the first human. Look at this. All in whose nostrils were the breath of life. It's there. Yeah, we know this guy. And when we look at these stories separately, they make sense. The 40 days and 40 nights and the 150, they're easily explained. Now, we have wonderful midrashim that tell us, it's 150 days the water was on the earth, but it was 40 days of rain. It's really easy when you see in one author, it's 40 days and 40 nights. Who, by the way, that author, Jay, uses 40 days and 40 nights all the time. And the other author uses 150 because guess what? It's basically half a year, which as a priest, he's a little bit more scientific than the J author. The J author is more of a poet. He's more of a great storyteller, not so concerned with details. Priestly author's like, it must have rained for 150 days. It must rain. How long does it have to rain for the whole world to be washed away? It's got to be 6 months. Not the J author. The J author is that rains for 40 days. For why? Because it's a good number. It's a symbolic number. It's a long time. But it's not like he's trying to think about how much rain it really takes to flood the world. The P author is thinking about that kind of stuff. And so this is a wonderful example. And again, look at the P author again with how many cubits, how many levels there are to the place, because the P author is a guy who wants to know details. He wants to know who's descended from who. He wants to know how big something is. He's not necessarily the most descriptive storyteller, but those two stories woven together gives us a beautiful, beautiful story. And one where people said, you know what? These stories are really nice. This story is a nice story. And you don't have to read them separately, but when you do, the stories make a lot more sense. Why did we keep two versions of it? Well, again, there probably was stories that people loved. And an author who puts those stories together, an editor, isn't doing it to distract or to confuse us. He's doing it because he wants to preserve these different traditions. Now we have a little bit more time, And I'm going to show you one more story, which is one of my favorite stories, maybe one of your favorite stories too, the story of Joseph. Now, what I love about this one is because this is another one where the stories are woven together, like literally like a tapestry. What's interesting about this one is that we have a few different authors, but really there's two different authors here. We call the northern guy, and then the J author, the same guy that we just read. So we see an E and J story together here, and we saw a J and P story before. So this will show you how they play off of each other by, again, the editor weaving these stories together. What's interesting about this one is this is a story of Joseph. He gives us some really important, gosh, we just talked about it in our class in Tuesday, is this helps explain why the tribes are what they are. Our ancestors, whether it's Reuben or Judah or Benjamin, they start to express themselves as patriarchs, right? And so we know that Joseph, let's look at the story. This is the E and J author. Joseph, I'm going to show you this one too because it's very easy. It's an easy one. Sometimes they're hard. By the way, this just tells us that these authors are also present here. They're not the main ones. The main one is the blue one and the blue one and the black text. Okay. And so I'm going to show you this. Gosh, I don't know if we have time to do the whole thing. Okay, well, we'll try. So I'm going to do this. So the E author is, I'm not going to tell you, but the E author I told you is a northerner. He's from the 10 northern tribes, like Reuben, like Issachar, Ephraim. And the J author here is the blue author. I already told you that. He's from the tribe of Judah. Well, I was going to try to see if you could see why. All right. This line here, these are the generations of Jacob. That's the priestly author. Why? Because he uses that phrase all the time. Elah Toldot Yaakov. So we know that line wasn't part of the E and J story, but it's okay. Joseph, it's not important. And this line here is also an editorial, an editor putting kind of where the story takes place. So it says, Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with their sons of Bilhah, and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought to their father an evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of long sleeves. And when the brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. And he said to them, "Hear, I beg you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we're holding the sheaves." I'm not going to read you the whole because I don't have time. He gives them the story of, I dreamed that you were all bowing down to me, right? You were all bowing down to my sheaf, and then you were also all bowing down to me. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars, you were all bowing down. And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And now the story continues. And his brothers went to feed their flocks in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Hineni, here I am," right? Here am I. And he said to him, "Go, I beg you, see whether it is well with your brothers, and well with the flocks, and go bring me word again." So he went out. So he sent him out from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, "What do you seek?" And he said, "I seek my brothers. Tell me, I beg you, where they feed the flocks." And the man said, "They have departed from here, for I have heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" And Joseph went with his brothers and found them in Dothan. And when they saw him from far away, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to slay him. Um, Notice, by the way, in this story, this first version, Joseph brought an evil report to their father. In this version, it says that Joseph is told by his father, "Go to your brothers and see what's going on." Now, I will point out, if these were written by the same author, there's something really, maybe you could say, wrong with what Jacob just did, because he just threw Jacob into Jacob threw Joseph into a situation where he knows his brothers hate him, and he knows he's brought it back an evil report of his brothers. So if he's doing that again, so he's going to get he's going to get Joseph to tattle on his brothers. He's really throwing Joseph into a bad situation. It seems as though this author is telling us this story and not throwing, in this case, would not be throwing Jacob under the bus, because Jacob doesn't, that's not part of his story. In his version, what in this other version, why they didn't like him was because that Jacob just loved him more than the other people. In the other version, in this version, and again, I'm doing this for the sake of time. In this version, when Joseph comes to them, doesn't say this whole story of him looking for him, but at some point when he's with them, they say, "Behold, the dreamer comes. Come now and let us slay him and throw him into a pit. And we will say some evil beast has devoured him, and we will see what become of his dreams." And Reuben heard it, and he saved him from their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but throw him in this pit in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him from their hands, to deliver him to his father again." And it came to pass, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped Joseph his coat of long sleeves that was on him. And they took him and threw him into the pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And then they sat down to eat, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilad with their camels bearing gum, balm, myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let us not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers were content. And there passed by Midianite merchants, and they drew him and lifted up Joseph out of the pit. And they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. And Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The child is not, and I, where shall I go?" And they took Joseph's coat, and they killed a goat and dipped it in their blood. Now, you see the problem here. In one version of the story makes a lot of sense if you read it like this. Reuben heard it, wanted to save him, right? Shed no blood, put him in this pit, and they took him and threw him in the pit, and the pit was empty, and there's no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread. And then passed by Midianite merchants, and they drew him up, and they took Joseph out of the pit. And Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The child is not." That story makes sense, which is that he left him there, or he had him thrown in there, and he was going to go back and get him. But while he was there, the Midianites come by and take him. In the other story, Judah says to the brothers, "And it came to pass, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his coat, his long sleeves that was on him. They lifted up their eyes and looked. Behold, a company of Ishmaelites came with their camels. And Judah said to his brother, What profit is if we slay him? Right? Let us sell him to the Ishmaelite, and let our hand be on him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers were content. And they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought him to Egypt. That story makes sense. Together, there's some problems there. And so the rabbi said, well, they put him in the pit, and then the Ishmaelites came and they bought him. The Midianites drew him out, but the Ishmaelites bought him from him. Look, in one story, it's Midianites. In another story, they're Ishmaelites. It's not a big difference. It's not a big deal. Nobody cares. They're all gone anyways. They're all Arabs or whatever. They all live in the Middle East. Nobody cares who's a Midianite Ishmaelite anymore. The authors did, by the way, because in one version, the Midianites are selling him. And in the other story, the Ishmaelites sell him. Okay? And Ishmael is the descendant of Abraham. And Midian is also a descendant of Abraham, but guess what? There's sometimes problems for us with the Midianites. Moses was married to a Midianite. So think about that, folks, too. And also look who's the hero of the story. In one version, it's Reuben who tries to save his brother but fails. In the other story, Judah is the hero in a kind of perverse way, which is let's not kill him, let's sell him. Both of them are heroes in their own way, in their own weird way, in that they tried to save Joseph. Reuben is the ancestor of the northern tribes. He's a northerner. And in that version, the northerner ancestor is the hero. In the Judah version, in the J version, Judah's the hero. Both stories exist. There's a tradition that Reuben was the one who tried to save him, and there's another version that Judah's the one who saved him. If you read the stories separately, they work much better than they do woven together. But they're not terribly wrong. I mean, it's not a real problem that they exist together as a woven story because, again, most people have read the story for a long time and nobody really, who cares? But I do think when you look at these stories and you realize that there's an issue behind them, that one group of people wanted their ancestor to be the hero and another group wanted their ancestor to be a hero. And what, of course, is interesting is there's two versions of Joseph and how he wound up in Egypt. But both of them, not we all, but they had a version that, this is how it wound up happening. Again, we have another version that we read in Chronicles where nobody winds up in Egypt except maybe the Levites or some small group of them. Because if Ephraim is in the land of Israel during the time of this is supposed to, we're supposed to be slaves, then there's another tradition that we didn't all go down to Egypt. But here we have an E and J version of how we wound up in Egypt. And again, is it a big deal? No, it's not a really big deal. The fact that these two stories exist should not undermine our love of the Torah. As I mentioned on Tuesday morning, yesterday, this does not make me feel less connected to my religion because I was aware of this. I have posted, or I will post when I get back today, some of the sources that if you want to read more about it, which I hope you do, Safari is what we use all the time to read text. We use it Tuesdays and Wednesdays. It's an amazing source. And it's always, if you ever have a question of what's in the Bible, you can go to Safari, you can see how it's organized, you can see the text, it's all there. Biblical Archaeology Review is the magazine that really deals with the archaeology and the understanding of, again, where writers who write about these questions of who wrote the Bible, where you can find it. It's not printed all the time. It comes out quarterly. It wasn't always like that. And then for very interesting discussions by the two people who taught me, Richard Elliott Friedman and David Noel Friedman. David Noel Friedman passed away. He was a distinguished chair professor at both Michigan and UCSD at the same time, and he was also the editor of the Anchor Bible. And Richard Elliott Friedman, they were not related. They were very different kinds of guys. Richard Elliott Friedman is the guy who wrote Who Wrote the Bible, which is the best book on who wrote the Bible. This guy, James Kugel, also wrote a really great book called How to Read the Bible, but this book is the ultimate book on who wrote the Bible and on how the Torah was written together, was edited together. He was my teacher as he was writing that book 40 years ago, and the book became a bestseller. It's still one of the best books on the Bible that there is, and it's very readable. It's a very easily understandable book, and he does the best job of explaining how we think these books were written, and it's still 40 years later is the definitive book. But if you want to see an interview with him, this is a recent interview with him, a podcast interview with him on a podcast called Judaism Unbound. Some good questions, some good discussions. And David Noel Friedman, this is a lecture that he gave at UCSD while he was probably within a year or two of him teaching me. And this guy was an amazing, again, he was so loved that he was a endowed chair at 2 different universities, which is almost unheard of. And the fact that he was also editing the Anchor Bible commentary series at the same time tells you how amazing he was. Very interesting guy. And this is a really good discussion of, specifically, he explains how scribes made errors and he does it in a really understandable way. He's a wonderful was a wonderful mensch, and again, he was he was at Michigan and UCSD simultaneously, kind of like the Schulmans who were running a practice in Beverly Hills and Detroit simultaneously. He was there. He was like them in that he was able to go back and forth between Michigan and Southern California seamlessly. But yeah, these are really good. These are really good discussions. This one's definitely more recent. Richard Friedman's discussion is only from like the last, I think, year. I think it was last year. David Noel Friedman's is about 40 years old, but he had a brilliant mind and a wonderful spirit. So, folks, this is definitely again one of my favorite things to talk about, to teach. But again, I don't focus on it a lot because at the end of the day, my professor Richard Friedman wrote and who wrote the Bible, and he very much wanted me to continue to study with him after I got my bachelor's. He wanted me to stay and stay at UCSD. And I thought to myself, why would I do that? He's never going to leave UCSD, and he did. He ended up becoming the endowed chair at University of Georgia about 15 years ago, maybe almost 15 years ago. And I always thought to myself, he's never going to leave. Why would anyone leave San Diego? Some of the other professors never left. He did leave, which I'm still shocked that he left. But he's a really great guy. But the reason I didn't become a biblical professor, and also again thinking I'd never be able to inherit that wonderful place. One of his students ended up becoming a woman who studied at the same time that I was there. I did go there for about 6 months for the doctoral program. Kind of dipped my toe into it. But one of the other students who was there at the time is the professor at San Diego State, which is not such a bad gig to have either. But anyways, the bigger issue is Richard Friedman wrote at the end of Who Wrote the Bible, at the end of the day, it's not who wrote the Bible, but who reads it. And I really didn't care about teaching Bible to people who were only in university. The idea that I was teaching it to people who only wanted to know what was going to be on the test was not something I wanted to do. And quite frankly, I wanted to teach it to my people, to the Jewish people. And Richard Friedman was actually Jewish and has spent a lot of time teaching Jewish people, and it's wonderful that he's done it. But he's also, again, that's not his form. That's not what he's there for. He's there to teach Bible to lots of people. And I had the really great ability as an undergraduate. David Noel Friedman brought me in to teach for him a couple times when he was out of town, and I got to teach as an undergraduate, which was a great honor. And yeah, I tasted what it was like because people came up to me after I was the sub and asked me if that was going to be on the test. And I said, I don't know what's going to be on the test. He didn't tell me. I taught what he wanted me to teach today. I assumed that it was important for you to learn. And I realized I never want to answer that question again. I never want to be responsible for what's on the test, because as far as I'm concerned, this is all on the test. This is the big test, exactly. And that's what my dad told me a long time ago. Every day is a final. So that was my dad's great. When I graduated that same school, UCSD, on my day of my graduation, my dad said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "I've been studying, Dad, for weeks, man. I finally finished. I got all my tests done." I said, I feel relieved. I'm done. He goes, no, son. Now every day is a final. And that was the greatest words my dad ever shared with me. Every day is a final. So it's true. Anyways, yeah, this is all on the final. So thank you, everybody. And we wish you a great rest of the Hog. I will tell you that we missed you. For the people who decided to be in this class today and missed the game, you missed nothing because it's 8-1. So thank you, everybody, for spending some time, because I would not have liked to have been watching the game. And yeah, J.D. Stein, meaning Joyce, just hearted it. So thank you. There's a logic to this. So we'll be back tomorrow. All right. Take care, everybody. Hag Sameach. Take care.